contemporary cultural discourse. Go on. Now, as you can see, that there are three particular, very quite famous adaptation studies theorists I have focused on. One being Linda Hutton. She has used a particular word called palimpsestic. Now, palimpsestic, you see that it is a kind of transposition on a certain written document or text, and which changes it over the time. She says that she uses the word palimpsestic to define adaptations as a repetition of story that signifies certain changes over time. So it takes some time, but an adaptation can change the original source word over the time, its meanings and its contextual meanings. Now, Hutton, sees adaptations as transformations, but they vary according to medium. My fellow presenter Shudito already has used a particular phrase that medium is the message. I guess he's not here, but medium is the message. And what Hutton essentially says that it is the medium that often conveys the meaning. That we often need a certain medium to convey certain meaning. For example, let's say the first case study that I will present, the Hunger Games. Even if it was not made into a film, it had already made its cultural impact by selling more than 100 million copies. So it was already there in the public discourse, and it had made a certain impact. Okay, but sometimes you see that how a thing is conveyed depends on the medium. Sometimes, like for example, if today we need to reach the Gen Z or the today's contemporary generation, probably we need the medium of reels and videos. That is more convenient. That is something we also need to keep in mind while we discuss adaptation studies. Okay, moving on to, so keep the slide. Brad McFarlane, he focuses on identifying the nature of relationship that a film may have with the novel or the text from which it is adapted. So there is always a relation that is quite evolving with the original source text and the adapted one. Okay, that is something we need to understand. And there is another thing that while we discuss adaptation studies at the larger length, that we do not need to see adaptation as something secondary. Okay, this idea of adaptation being secondary have quite changed, and today, as McFarlane says, that we cannot prioritize one medium over the other. Okay, every medium has its own audience, every medium has its own context to deliver a certain message. So that is also something we need to say. Like for example, sometimes you see that voice messages in WhatsApp groups, they are impactful. Sometimes even that the members of the group will not play that, so we type that. We know that members very well, so we type that. So medium often conveys the message, and that actually took that quote from Marshall McLuhan, Canadian theorist. So that is quite important, that medium is often the message itself. So in which medium we are talking right now? Okay, so that often not only depends on what is the content, but also the context and the audience. More than the content that I am trying to deliver, it is at which context I am trying to deliver the content. That is more important, and that determines the existence of that particular medium and relevance of it also. Okay, keep that. Robert Stam, another critic, okay, while Stam says that adaptations are essentially a dialogic process that engages conversation. That is something that we need to understand, that adaptations are not one-dimensional. It can, provoke reactions as well. So it's a dialogic process. It involves conversations as well. Now, move to the next slide. Now, those who have some bit of knowledge about adaptation studies, and I believe many of present here should have that. Most of the people now have focused on adaptation and focusing on the fidelity criticism. That is, that whether the adapted material is faithful to the original source text. Okay, that's how we generally tend to see an adaptation. That whether, suppose when, for example, let's say Shadit Rai, for example, adapted Pathe Pachari. So the critics, maybe, I don't know who were at that time, but they may have seen that from the point of view of the particular source text, whether Ray is justifying the original story on screen. Okay, that was conventional way to focus on the fidelity criticism. But now the fidelity criticism, this remained a particular idea to analyze adaptation, but that is slowly changing. Okay, now this changing because we do no longer see adaptations as only a mere imitation or copy of an original work. That is also something we need to focus. Now, my paper argues that these adaptations, move on to the next slide. My paper argues that these adaptations should not be seen as inferior or secondary product to the source material. Rather, these are collaborative and interpretive works. Like for example, I may not find a particular book interesting, but I may find the particular film made on that particular book very engaging. So this may happen. So it's a collaborative and interpretive work that expands the cultural discourse of a storytelling. Okay, essentially, whether I'm writing a book or whether I'm making a film, I'm telling a story. So end of the day, all creators are storytellers and nothing else. Okay. Now, we live in an age where media narratives, we must keep in mind, that shape the influence our cultural discourse. Okay. So if you are aware of the current situation of our neighboring country, you will understand that only social media influencers, they are bringing a certain violent change in a certain country. So you understand that media narratives is very important and vital in today's contemporary society. Okay. Now, we will focus that adaptations are often cultural artifacts, and they are medium specific. We need to understand that certain particular adaptations, they deserve a certain medium for their particular representation. Moving on to the next. Now, as we come to the visual narrative, as we come to the cinema, as we come to the cinema or visual narrative, we find that the visual tools are very significant in a particular medium like cinema. For example, the setting, how it is portrayed, the cinematography, the editing, the sound. As I have to omit a lot of things here right now because of the paucity of the time, but I have mentioned in my paper, and as and when you read the paper, that how the filmmaker has adapted the book accordingly to the setting, to the sound, to the editing, and other narrative symbolisms. Next. Now, we also, before I come to this first case study, in this regard, it is very essential to remember that a significant share of audience may differ from the consumers of the source material. You must understand that suppose a book, particular book, it is written for a certain kind of audience, but a particular film may have a different target audience. That is something we need to understand while we study this. Okay. And also another thing, vice versa, that adaptations are often influenced by the expectation of the target audience. Okay, sometimes a novel which gets the tag of a bestseller novel, sometimes they are adapted to cater to a certain popular section of the audience, or popular, let's say, populist ideals of that section. Okay, so we need to understand that audience may also shape the adaptation. That is also something we need to understand. As time is running away, my first case study is The Hunger Games. This is a novel by Susan Collins. It is a trilogy, and the first film was made in 2012. Okay, by Gary Ross. It had a massive global impact, not as a film but also as a book. It had already sold. The report suggests that the series has sold more than 100 million copies worldwide, even before the first film released. So it had its impact already. The film just enhanced it worldwide. That we can say. Okay. Now, moving on to the next. Now, why I have chosen this text? It might seem that this novel, this particular novel, the Hunger Games series, it falls under the category of young adult literature. But the protagonist, who is Katniss Everdeen, is not a common archetype of a female lead character. but rather he is presented as a character who survives political manipulation. And the adaptation broadens the novel's cultural impact by portraying Katniss as a symbol of resistance. So Katniss is not just a simple, lead character, but she is someone who is fighting a battle of survival and battle to the death, and also someone who is fighting against any sort of operations that we see in this world. Next. Now, next is Gone Girl. Gone Girl is a novel that was, particularly published in 2012, and it was adapted by David Fincher in 2014. Now, what is very interesting in case of this adaptation is the difference between both these adaptations. That in case of Gone Girl, the screenplay is written by Gillian Flynn herself. So the original writer has written the screenplay. So we can expect a certain degree of authenticity and adherence to the original source text, because the writer is the original writer of the novel. Now we find that this film, as it caters to a global audience, it focuses on certain important things. Go on to the next. Okay. This particular work is relevant today because it focuses on modern relationships and marriage. Okay, where we find this particular female character, Emmy. Emmy goes missing. She goes missing, and we are given two narratives. One, a very unreliable narrative of Emmy herself through her diary entries, and with the present scenario where there is an investigation about Emmy. Now we find that Emmy and her husband Nick, they were in a very stable relationship, but suddenly Emmy could not find that the relationship working, and she goes missing. And it creates a media sensation because Emmy was already a social media star. At the same time, we find that Flynn's own screenplay retained the essence of the novel, and eventually it was greatly filmed by Fincher. Fincher is quite an expert filmmaker, and he knows his job quite well. And another thing that I have written it in quite detail, but I just want to mention that the dark and cold color patterns with extremely obscure lighting illustrates that psychological realism to the great extent. And the color palettes and atmospheric setting adds to the elements of thrill. So as you read the thriller, as you read a psychological thriller, it gives a certain element of, let's say, thrill as a reading public, but when you see it on screen, you also can sense that particular essence is written in the visual medium. Okay. So coming to the close, go on to the next. I would just like to mention that there are certain themes which match in both these particular adaptations. Like particularly, there is critique of media and media sensationalism. The way the particular disappearance of Amy is sensationalized in this particular narrative is very important. And also in Hunger Games, the challenge is to the power. So the protagonist in both the text, they challenges the conventional gender norms, conventional political norms. Okay, that is also something we find. And Gone Girl is critiques the conventional gender roles that we expect from women, that they have to be in a domestic sphere and they cannot voice their inner desires. But Emmy somehow breaks that stereotypes because probably she can, and because she has that hold over her husband economically and otherwise status wise also. That is probably been shown in the narrative. Now both the adaptations, we must remember that Hunger Games and Gone Girl, they are from different genres, but they significantly share common themes. That is, one critiquing the role of media and another critiquing the role of abuse of power. Okay, that is something.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, I would like to end this, and thank you everyone for your kind time. Thank you.